The Thornton family had always been about appearances. Old money, old name, old expectations. My grandfather, Robert Thornton III, owned a sprawling estate in Connecticut, 12 acres of waterfront property with a main house built in 1887, a guest cottage, a boathouse, and gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines. The estate had been in the family for 4 generations. Market value by 2019, approximately $4.8 million. Everyone assumed it would pass to my father, Robert Thornton IV, as the eldest son. Through him, eventually to my older brother Carter and sister Sarah. That's how it had always worked in the Thornton family, eldest son to eldest son, preserving the legacy. I was Emma Thornton, the youngest of 3, born 7 years after Sarah. The unexpected child. The one who didn't quite fit the family mold. Carter was charismatic, athletic, headed to Yale like 3 generations of Thornton men before him. Sarah was beautiful, social, engaged to a hedge fund manager by age 24. They were golden children who understood the importance of the Thornton name. I was quiet, bookish, studying library science at a state school because I'd chosen education over prestige. At family gatherings, I'd sit in corners reading while Carter networked and Sarah orchestrated photo opportunities. Emma's our little intellectual, Mom would say with a laugh that wasn't quite kind. Not everyone can be a leader. But Grandpa Robert saw me differently. While everyone else was busy performing for each other, Grandpa and I would slip away to his library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, first editions, leather chairs that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. We talk for hours about everything and nothing, books, history, philosophy, the importance of quiet contemplation in a loud world. You're the only one who actually listens, Grandpa told me once when I was 16. The others hear themselves talk, but you listen to other people. When I was in college, struggling with tuition even at a state school, Grandpa quietly helped. Not loans, gifts. Education is never wasted, he'd say, pressing a check into my hand. Don't tell your mother. She wouldn't understand. After I graduated, I got a job as an archivist at a historical society in Hartford, making $43,000 a year. It was meaningful work that I loved, but it wasn't impressive by Thornton standards. Still playing with old papers? Carter would ask at Christmas dinners, his tone making it clear what he thought of my career. When are you going to get a real job? Sarah would add, showing off her engagement ring. I'd smile and change the subject. They didn't understand that I was happy, that I'd chosen meaning over money, purpose over prestige. Grandpa understood, though. He'd worked in insurance his whole career, practical, unglamorous work that had maintained the family fortune without adding flash. He respected honest work. In 2017, Grandpa's health started declining. He was 87, still mentally sharp but physically frail. He'd had a couple of small strokes. The doctors said he had maybe 2 or 3 years left. My parents immediately started discussing the estate transition. Not with Grandpa about him. Carter and Sarah would join these conversations, planning how to modernize the property, whether to sell or keep it, how to maximize its value. Nobody asked me what I thought. I was just Emma, the quiet one who'd be fine with whatever the family decided. But Grandpa noticed how they talked about the estate like he was already dead. How they measured the property in dollars instead of memories. How none of them actually spent time there anymore except for obligatory holiday visits. I, meanwhile, visited every Sunday. I'd help Grandpa in the garden, the one physical activity he could still manage. We'd sit on the porch overlooking the water, talking and reading in comfortable silence. I'd help organize his papers, catalog his book collection, ensure his staff was treating him well. One Sunday in March 2019, Grandpa asked me to meet him at his attorney's office. I thought maybe he needed help understanding some paperwork. Instead, I walked into a meeting that would change everything. Emma, Grandpa said, holding my hand across the conference table, I want you to have the estate. I stared at him, shocked. Grandpa, no. Dad is your son. Carter is the eldest grandson. The estate should go to people who actually give a damn about it, he interrupted, his voice sharp despite his frailty. Your father sees it as an asset. Carter sees it as a party venue. Sarah wants to gut it and modernize it. You're the only one who understands what this place really is. His attorney, Margaret Walsh, slid documents across the table. Your grandfather wants to transfer the estate to you through a deed executed during his lifetime, not through his will, which could be contested. A direct transfer, effective immediately. But the family I started. The family will survive, Grandpa said firmly. I'm leaving your father and your aunt substantial cash from my other assets. They'll be fine financially. But this estate, this house, this land, this history, goes to someone who actually values it. Margaret explained the legal structure. A quitclaim deed transferring the property from Robert Thornton III to Emma Louise Thornton. Filed immediately with the county, legally binding, irrevocable once executed. Your family doesn't need to know right away, Grandpa said. Let them make their plans. Let them show you who they really are. When the time comes, you'll have the proof you need. We signed the papers on March 22, 2019. The deed transferred that day. Filed with the Fairfield County Recorder's Office. Completely legal. Public record, if anyone bothered to check. The estate, the 12 acres, the main house, the cottage, everything became mine. At age 25, I owned a $4.8 million property. And I told no one. For the next 4 years, I lived a double life more surreal than I could have imagined. Publicly, I was Emma Thornton, modestly paid archivist, living in a small apartment in Hartford, driving a 9-year-old Honda Civic. The family member everyone had written off as unmemorable. Privately, I owned a $4.8 million estate that my family thought belonged to Grandpa and would eventually be divided among them. The estate's carrying costs were substantial, property taxes of $68,000 annually, insurance, maintenance, staff salaries for the groundskeeper and housekeeper. Grandpa had set up a trust to cover these expenses during his lifetime, but after the deed transfer, those costs technically became my responsibility. Grandpa and I worked out an arrangement where he'd continue covering expenses until his death, at which point I'd need to manage them myself. He wanted me to have time to prepare financially. So I prepared. I lived frugally, saved aggressively, invested carefully. By 2023, I'd built up a cash reserve of $78,000 specifically for estate expenses. Not much compared to the property's value, but enough to cover 2 years of carrying costs. And I watched my family plan their future with my property. At Thanksgiving 2019, Carter announced he wanted to turn the boathouse into a sick party venue once he inherited his share. Sarah talked about opening up the floor plan and modernizing the kitchen in the main house. Mom discussed selling the cottage separately to maximize value. They talked about the estate like it was already theirs. Like Grandpa was already gone. He sat at the head of the table, eating his dinner quietly, while they divided up his life's most precious possession. I caught his eye once. He gave me the smallest smile. At Christmas 2021, Dad brought a real estate appraiser to dinner. Actually brought a professional to evaluate the property, while Grandpa was sitting right there. Just getting a current market value, Dad explained casually. For estate planning purposes. The appraiser valued it at $5.2 million. Dad, Carter, and Sarah spent the rest of dinner calculating their shares. $1.3 million each if split 4 ways between Mom, Dad, Carter, and Sarah. Nobody mentioned me. I wasn't part of the equation. I sat quietly, helping Grandpa with his dinner, saying nothing. Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep on February 14, 2023, 2 weeks after his 93rd birthday. I found him when I came for a usual Sunday visit. He looked peaceful, like he'd simply decided it was time. I sat with him for an hour before calling anyone, saying goodbye, thanking him for seeing me when no one else did. At the funeral, my family performed grief beautifully. Carter gave a moving eulogy about Grandpa's legacy. Sarah cried picturesque tears. Mom and Dad greeted guests with dignified sorrow. I stood in the back, genuinely devastated, my grief too real and raw for performance. After the funeral, Dad announced there would be a meeting at the estate attorney's office in 2 weeks to discuss the estate distribution. My stomach clenched. This was it. The moment Grandpa had predicted, I immediately called Margaret Walsh. It's happening. The family meeting. They think they're inheriting the estate. Are you ready? Margaret asked gently. No, I admitted. But it doesn't matter. Grandpa wanted me to protect the estate. I'm going to do it. I have all the documentation prepared, Margaret said. The deed, the transfer records, everything. When the moment comes, we'll be ready. The meeting was scheduled for March 1st, 2023, at Margaret Walsh's office in Stamford. I arrived early, parked my old Civic next to Carter's new BMW and Sarah's Audi, and walked into the building with my heart pounding. Margaret's receptionist gave me a subtle nod. She knew what was coming. The conference room was already filling up. Dad and Mom at one end of the table, looking solemn and important. Carter lounging in a chair, confident and relaxed. Sarah checking her phone, bored with the formality. And Michael Brennan, my father's personal attorney, sitting beside Dad with a briefcase full of documents. Wait. Why was Dad's attorney here? Margaret was Grandpa's attorney. Margaret entered and took her seat at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time. Let's just get through this, Dad said briskly. We all know how the estate was structured. I'm the eldest son, so the property passes to me, then eventually to my children. Margaret's expression didn't change. Actually, we're here to discuss the disposition of Robert Thornton's assets as outlined in his will and through various transfers executed during his lifetime. Right. Carter jumped in. We're selling Grandpa's estate and dividing it equally, my brother announced confidently. 4 ways, MOM, Dad, me, and Sarah. He looked directly at me for the first time. Not you, obviously. Everyone laughed. Mom smiled indulgently at Carter. Sarah smirked. Even Michael Brennan chuckled slightly. I kept my hands folded in my lap and said nothing. The estate is worth $5.2 million according to the most recent appraisal, Carter continued, pulling out a document. Split 4 ways, that's $1.3 million each. I've already talked to a developer who's interested in the waterfront portion. Carter, Margaret interrupted quietly, I need to stop you there. Why? Dad said sharply. This is straightforward. The estate passes to me as Robert's eldest son, then to my wife and children. We've already agreed on the division. May I see the deed you're referring to? I asked quietly. Everyone turned to look at me like they'd forgotten I was there. What? Sarah said. I nodded quietly. May I see the deed? The property deed showing ownership of the estate. Margaret slid a document across the table. It was an old deed from 1987, showing Robert Thornton III as the owner. I looked at it carefully, then smiled. This isn't the current deed. What are you talking about? Dad demanded. Of course it is. That's Dad's deed from when he inherited from his father. It was the deed, I said calmly. But property ownership changes when deeds are transferred. Has anyone checked the county records recently? Silence. Confused faces. Then I pulled out a folder from my bag. Inside was a notarized document, the quitclaim deed from March 22, 2019, transferring the property from Robert Thornton III to Emma Louise Thornton. I slid it across the table. Mom's face went pale. Dad grabbed the document, his hands shaking slightly as he read. His face went from confused to white to bright red. This is fake, he said flatly. This is a forgery. It's not, Margaret said calmly. She pulled out her own copy. On March 22, 2019, Robert Thornton III executed a quitclaim deed transferring the estate property to his granddaughter Emma. The deed was properly notarized, witnessed, and filed with the Fairfield County Recorder's Office on that same day. She laid out more documents. Here is the filed deed with the county stamp. Here is the recorded instrument number. Here is the property tax record showing Emma Thornton as the legal owner since April 2019. That's impossible, Carter shouted, standing up so fast his chair tipped backward. Grandpa would never. Grandpa absolutely would, I said quietly. And did. Sarah was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. You've owned the estate for 4 years? For 4 years, and you never said anything, Grandpa asked me not to, I said simply. He wanted to see how everyone would act, how you'd treat me when you thought I was getting nothing, how you'd treat the estate when you thought it was yours to divide. Michael Brennan, Dad's attorney, was speed reading through the deed. His expression grew grimmer with each line. "This appears to be legally executed," he said quietly to my father. "Filed and recorded properly. There has to be a way to contest this," Dad insisted. "Undue influence. Emma manipulated him when he was sick." Robert Thornton was evaluated by 2 independent physicians before executing this deed, Margaret said, pulling out medical evaluations. Both certified him as mentally competent and fully capable of making informed decisions about his property. She laid out the evaluations, dated March 15, 2019, 1 week before the deed transfer. Furthermore, Margaret continued, Robert specifically addressed the possibility of a contest in a letter he wrote explaining his decision. "Would you like me to read it?" Before anyone could answer, she pulled out a letter in Grandpa's handwriting. "To my family," Margaret read. "If you're hearing this letter, it means you've discovered that I transferred the estate to Emma. I made this decision with a clear mind and full understanding of what I was doing." Her voice was steady, but I could hear Grandpa's voice in every word. "For the past 30 years, I've watched this family treat the estate as a commodity to be monetized rather than a legacy to be preserved. You've measured it in dollars while Emma has measured it in memories. You've planned its destruction while Emma has honored its history." Carter was shaking his head in denial. Sarah had tears streaming down her face, not sad tears, angry ones. Margaret continued reading. "Emma is the only one who visited me not because she wanted something, but because she valued my company. She's the only one who understands what this property represents. She's the only one I trust to protect it. I'm leaving substantial financial assets to my children and other grandchildren. But this estate, my true legacy, goes to the person who earned it through loyalty and love." The letter ended with Grandpa's signature and the date, March 20th, 2019. Mom finally found her voice, and it was full of venom. "You manipulated a lonely old man. You spent time with him specifically to what?" I interrupted, my voice harder than I'd ever used with my family. "To actually care about him? To value him as a person instead of a bank account? Yes, I did that. But it wasn't manipulation. It was love." I stood up, tired of sitting while they loomed over me. I visited Grandpa every Sunday for 8 years. Every single Sunday, even when I was struggling with work or money or life. I sat with him, talked with him, helped him because I loved him. I looked at Carter. "When's the last time you visited Grandpa without it being a holiday or birthday?" Carter's mouth opened and closed. "Sarah, how many Sunday dinners did you skip because you had brunch plans with friends?" Sarah looked away. "Dad, when's the last time you called Grandpa just to talk? Not to discuss finances or estate planning, but just to see how he was doing?" Silence. "Grandpa didn't give me the estate because I manipulated him," I said. "He gave it to me because I was the only one who saw him as a person instead of an inheritance." Michael Brennan cleared his throat. "Even if the deed is valid, and it appears to be, surely we can work out some kind of arrangement. Emma could sell the property and divide the proceeds, or buy out the other family members' expectations." "No," I said simply. "What?" Dad said sharply.
No, irapat.
"The estate is mine, legally and morally. I'm not selling it. I'm not dividing it. I'm not buying out anyone's expectations because nobody had any legal right to expect anything." I pulled out another document, my plan for the estate that I'd been developing for 4 years. "I'm converting the main house into a historical archive and research center," I said. "The guest cottage will be housing for visiting scholars. The grounds will be preserved as they are. The estate will be placed in a conservation easement to prevent future development." The horror on their faces would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. "You can't," Sarah shrieked. "That property is worth over $5 million. You're going to turn it into a library?" "A research center," I corrected, "focusing on Connecticut history and genealogy. It's what Grandpa would have wanted, the estate serving a purpose beyond just existing as a status symbol. This is insane,
Carter yelled.
You're destroying millions of dollars in value for some idealistic nonsense. I'm preserving a piece of history, I said calmly. Something you'd understand if you valued anything besides money. Dad stood up, his face purple with rage. I'm your father. I'm contesting this deed. We'll tie this up in court for years. You'll lose, Margaret interrupted coldly. The deed is ironclad. Robert was competent, the transfer was legal, and it's been the recorded ownership for 4 years. Any contest will fail and cost you significant legal fees. She pulled out one more document. Furthermore, Robert's will specifically states that any family member who contests Emma's ownership of the estate will forfeit their inheritance from his other assets. That stopped Dad cold. What other assets? Robert had approximately $3.2 million in various accounts and investments, Margaret said. His will divides these among his children and other grandchildren, $800,000 to your father, $400,000 to each of you grandchildren, with various smaller bequests. She looked at Dad. If you contest the estate transfer, you forfeit your $800,000. Carter and Sarah would forfeit their $400,000 each. Robert was very clear about this. Respect Emma's ownership or lose everything. The calculation was instant and visible on their faces. Fight for a share of the estate they might not win and lose the guaranteed money? Or accept the money and walk away. Money won. It always did with them. This is blackmail, Dad said weakly. This is a man protecting his final wishes, Margaret corrected. You can accept the inheritance Robert left you, or you can fight and lose everything. Your choice. I picked my bag. I'm leaving now. Margaret will handle the distribution of Grandpa's other assets to those who choose to accept them respectfully. I walked toward the door. Carter's voice stopped me. You're going to regret this. When you're stuck with that money pit of a property, drowning in taxes and maintenance costs, you're going to wish you'd sold it when you could. I turned back. I've been paying the property taxes for a year already. I've been planning for the carrying costs since 2019. I'm not unprepared, Carter. I'm just not greedy. And when you need money? Sarah added spitefully. When you're still making your pathetic salary and that house is falling apart around you? Then I'll figure it out, I said simply. Because, unlike you, I don't measure my worth in dollars. I looked at my mother, who'd been silent through most of this, her face tight with barely controlled rage. I hope you're happy, Mom said coldly. You've destroyed this family. Grandpa destroyed nothing, I said quietly. He revealed the truth. You destroyed yourselves by treating him like a walking trust fund instead of a person who deserved love. And then I walked out, leaving my family in ruins behind me. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the estate, my estate, and sat on the porch where Grandpa and I had spent so many Sundays together. My phone started ringing immediately.
Dad.
Carter.
Sarah.
Numbers I didn't recognize. I turned it off. Margaret texted. You were magnificent. Robert would be so proud. I sat on that porch until sunset, processing everything. The confrontation I'd been dreading for 4 years. The moment when my family's true colors had been fully revealed. Over the next weeks, the consequences rippled outward. Dad, Carter, and Sarah all accepted their inheritances from Grandpa's other assets, $800,000 for $100,000 and $400,000 respectively. They took the money and severed contact with me entirely. Mom sent one email. You are no longer welcome at family gatherings. You've made your choice. I didn't respond. I'd made my choice 4 years ago, when I'd signed that deed with Grandpa. Everything since then had just been the inevitable conclusion. What I did do was begin the transformation of the estate. I hired architects who specialized in historical preservation. I worked with the Connecticut Historical Society to establish the research center. I created a nonprofit foundation to manage the property and ensure its preservation in perpetuity. The carrying costs were substantial, $72,000 annually in taxes alone, plus maintenance, insurance, and utilities. But I'd been planning for this. I'd lived frugally for 4 years, saved aggressively, and the research center would eventually generate some revenue through grants and research fees. It would be tight. I'd essentially be working to support the estate rather than myself. But that was the choice I'd made, preserving something meaningful over personal enrichment. 6 months after the confrontation, I got an unexpected visitor. Margaret Walsh appeared at the estate one Saturday morning. "I have something for you," she said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a check for $400,000. I stared at it, confused. "What is this?" "Roberts will had a provision I didn't mention at the family meeting," Margaret said with a slight smile. "A separate bequest specifically to you, to be delivered 6 months after his death." She pulled out a letter in Grandpa's handwriting. "Dear Emma," I read, my eyes filling with tears. "If you're reading this, you've faced the family and stood your ground. I'm proud of you. This money is to help with the estate's carrying costs. Use it wisely. Love always, Grandpa." I cried. Standing in the library where we'd spent so many hours together, I cried for the grandfather who'd seen me when no one else did, who'd trusted me with his most precious possession, who'd planned for my success even after his death. 5 years after Grandpa's death, I stood in what was now the Thornton Historical Research Center, watching scholars pore over documents in the reading room we'd created in the former dining room. The estate had been transformed. The main house was a fully functional research facility with climate-controlled archives, reading rooms, and offices. The guest cottage housed visiting researchers. The grounds were maintained as they'd been in Grandpa's time. Beautiful, peaceful, historically preserved. The center had become regionally known for its Connecticut history collection and genealogy resources. We hosted school groups, academic researchers, and amateur historians. The work was meaningful, the mission was clear, and Grandpa's legacy was preserved. Financially, it was still tight. The $400,000 bequest had covered initial renovations and provided an operating cushion, but the center's revenue only partly offset the costs. I still worked as an archivist to support myself, and I lived simply to support the estate. But I'd never been happier. My family remained estranged. Dad, Carter, and Sarah had used their inheritances for various purposes. Dad retired early, Carter bought a condo in Manhattan, Sarah upgraded her house. They'd gotten their money and moved on. Mom sent a Christmas card every year with no note, just her signature. A gesture toward maintaining appearance, without actual reconciliation. I didn't miss them. That should have been sad, but it was actually liberating. I'd built a chosen family among the scholars and volunteers at the center, people who valued the same things I did. Last month, a historian from Yale came to use the archives. After her research session, she approached me. "I heard the story," she said, "about how your grandfather left you this estate and your family contested it." I tensed, waiting for judgment. "I think what you've done here is remarkable," she continued. "Most people would have sold it and taken the money. You chose to preserve history instead. That takes courage." After she left, I walked the grounds as I did every evening. Past the gardens Grandpa had tended, down to the waterfront he'd loved, through the rooms where we talked about books and life and what really mattered. Carter had been wrong. I didn't regret keeping the estate. I didn't drown in costs or wish I'd sold. Because the value wasn't in the $5.2 million the property was worth. It was in the preservation of something meaningful, in honoring the man who'd seen my worth when no one else did, in building something that would outlast all of us. Grandpa had given me more than property. He'd given me proof that I was worth believing in, that my quiet loyalty and steady presence had value, that showing up mattered more than showing off. In a family that had always chosen flash over substance, noise over nuance, money over meaning, Grandpa had chosen me. And in doing so, he taught me the most important lesson. True legacy isn't about how much you accumulate. It's about what you preserve, what you protect, what you pass forward. I stood on the porch as the sun set over the water, the same porch where Grandpa and I had spent so many Sundays, and I smiled. The Thornton estate wasn't just preserved. It was thriving, not as a commodity, but as a contribution. Not as an asset, but as a gift to future generations. That was worth more than any amount of money. That was legacy.